Muy buenos días.
Good morning. I'll try to be brief given the time, and after listening to so many interesting presentations. It's almost 12:30 when I was supposed to speak at 12, but if you bear with me, I would like to thank the Cuban Attorney General's office, especially Dario, for inviting me one more year to attend this event. For me, it's the second time I come, and especially I thank you for the opportunity of coming back to Havana once more and meeting again Cuban and Spanish friends that I haven't seen for a long time, and we met on the plane on the way here. I come to this international forum to talk about corruption and prevention from the viewpoint of the academy as professor of criminal law in the University of Cádiz, Spain. And we study the reality. In this case, I'm in Cuba, and I try to make a comparative analysis between the arsenal of the Cuban criminal code compared with the Spanish criminal code to see up to what extent if those instruments in both codes are effective, or what are the most effective instruments to tackle corruption. In the sense of reaffirming on repeated occasions that this crime ignores borders and barriers, and therefore, although there's a comparison between the Spanish and Cuban legal order, there is no need to say that there is an international background of organizations to which both Cuba and Spain are members of that should determine that this set of legal tools shouldn't be different from one country to another, given the fact that Cuba on the one hand and Spain on the other hand are immersed, not unbound by United Nations conventions like the one against corruption, but at the regional level in Latin America or in Europe, in organizations and agencies that also fight this crime regionally. So from this perspective, I had divided my presentation into 5 sections. There is a number of slides that help us advance this topic, although I won't elaborate on all of them because of time constraints. I wanted to make an introduction on how we place corruption in both criminal codes, an important reference to the principle of offensiveness of the legal goods at stake when we talk about corruption. Then the active subject, the public official that could link the name of a public administration with his actions. And I wanted also to analyze the principle of injuries. What can we understand today as corruption? And I wanted to conclude by making reference to the mechanisms to prevent corruption. With this brief introduction, let's move on. I wanted to begin by saying that the approach of corruption could be done from a dual perspective, that although they are separated, they will naturally converge eventually. The analysis of the phenomena of corruption can be undertaken from the perspective of the individual involved, mainly in corporate entity, including bribes, gifts that people try to make an individual that can take decisions or make decisions that they make decisions in a way that are beneficial to their specific interests. When we try to come closer to the phenomenon of corruption from the viewpoint of the one giving the gift or the bribe to the public officials, so they decide in their favor whether we're talking about a natural or corporate body. In the academy where I work, we classify this type of the phenomenon in order to better understand its importance from the viewpoint of economic criminal law and of corporate law. So we talk about private corruption. We talk about the crimes that affect intellectual property. And there is a series of crimes that in the long run, according to the Spanish Criminal Code, affect the social and economic order of the nation. However, if we see corruption from the other perspective on the side of the public official that makes the decision and does so, ignoring his duties or the duties inherent to their position, rather than talking about corporate law, the objective is placed then in the public official. So we then move to the criminal law of the public function that highlights or reveals the crimes of malfeasance, bribery, embezzlement, in which public officials make a decision against the public administration that this public official is supposed to serve. In other countries like Cuba, for example, when you talk about the criminal law at the level of the public or state-owned company, well, now more recently we've seen that there's been significant changes in this wonderful country that has opened up the way to private activities like the small private restaurants, and multinationals are now coming to the island. So when we talked about the criminal law of corporations, we automatically leaped, and we were not only talking about the corporate law, but public companies law. Therefore, rather than talking of private corruption, rather than talking about crimes against intellectual property, we were directly talking and including under the label of corruption. We were immediately or automatically talking about malfeasance, embezzlement, and bribery. Now, when in the market, the state and private economic activities have to coexist, we can divide it into the both groups I already told you about. In this regard, I would like to make reference to this phenomenon from the perspective of the law from the public function, not from the perspective of corporations or companies. In order to concentrate now on public officials, state activities are not necessarily of a business character. Public service, both in Spain and Cuba, pursue a series of interests that not necessarily have an economic or business character. From this perspective, as I said, I want to talk about or to identify what's the legal good protecting these crimes linked to corruption. I think this is very important to identify the legal good that protects all the figures that in any part of the world are involved in a crime of corruption must be done before criminal intervention. If we identify the legal good protected from the criminal code, these will be relative because they will be losing their legal character.
Legislador que ha decidido castigar determinadas conductas y no.
Thus punishing actions. Therefore, we must focus our attention in a moment previous to the criminal code and in the different state models designed by our constitutions. And in this regard, both the Cuban and Spanish constitutions are rich in the number of standards that and the provisions that rule our public service and servants. We unfortunately don't have time to elaborate on each of these provisions, but I do think it is important to highlight here that in both countries, public service must serve the interest of citizens. When we talk about crimes against public service, we're talking about behaviors that affect or undermine not only the good reputation of public service or public administration, but especially the function and the role that those entities are supposed to undertake in order to protect the interest of citizens. Therefore, we can say that whenever a public official or servant or a given authority makes a decision that ignores the collective interest, but only particular or specific interests, those decisions will always undermine the principle of impartial and objective actions. The model provided and enshrined in both constitutions. Therefore, if we leave the term public administration or public service, those functions that the administration must undertake in order to protect citizens stands out. Citizens that mainly in times of crisis are more sensitive and more aware of the actions of the state that have no other function to protect their interest. I would like to highlight and identify this legal good as public administration makes us focus our attention that whenever a public official makes a decision of this nature is undermining, not only jeopardizing the interests that are provided for in our Constitution. As you know, when we talk about such broad legal goods, this is more difficult to identify. Next slide. In this case, I would like to devote 2 times to what is provided in the Cuban Criminal Code and the Spanish Criminal Code. Just from the viewpoint of a Spanish law professor, of course, always being prudent and respectful because I'm not in my country and I'm referring to a criminal code that is not my own. In the Cuban Criminal Code, the different types of crime I'm referring to are all included in the second title of crimes against public management or administration and jurisdiction. Of all those crimes included here, we must state that only the ones that are punished in chapters 1, 3, and 4 have to do with those actions against public administration committed or perpetrated by Cuban public servants or officials. These type of crimes are defined in a broad chapter of the Cuban Criminal Code, and therefore some nuances are lost, especially in the criminal character of these behaviors. I feel, and I don't know, all these crimes included in such a broad title in the first chapter I was referring to make reference to violation of duties inherent to their position, as if the other behaviors did not entail a violation of the duties inherent to their position, to their public position, and do not entail damages to the public service or administration they serve to. In the case of DC, officials who use for their own ends their position or abuse their position for personal benefits, this is often diluted. And in the third chapter, we have the crime of embezzlement that is not included within the second title, but you must go to Article 336 within heritage crimes in order to find where this crime is of embezzlement is punished, because they're trying to protect the public or state heritage, but heritage in the whole. And the Spanish Criminal Code went on and about in the last few years, and all these crimes are included in Title 19, and they are classified as crimes against public administration or public management or service. A series of changes undertaken in 1995 took place. Some behaviors were eliminated, some sanctions were changed. For example, in the case of embezzlement, that had a very severe penalty compared to crimes against human life, that was disproportionate. And since this legal good was defined, these crimes became more evident. Thirdly, I'm going as fast as I can. If we make a brief reference to who is the active subject of this type of behavior, this is a very important topic to take into consideration. I think the active subject is very important because since we do not concentrate ourselves in the violation of duties inherent to the position, now they can be active subjects. Now private citizens can also be perpetrators of this crime, and they are not violating any duty inherent to their position because they don't hold any public office. But they do undermine or jeopardize the legal goods of the public administration. I would like to highlight that active subjects. Who are the public officials? They are the ones who have the power to attribute their actions to the administration they represent, linking and binding and compromising that administration with their actions. Therefore, it is very important to define as clearly as possible who are these individuals who have this possibility of linking their actions to public service or management or administration. In the Spanish Criminal Code, we have to resort to two articles, Article 24 and to Article 427. That, as you can see from this slide, although it is within the crime of bribe, it provides protection also to the Cuban public administration when it makes reference to public officials of other public administrations. So the Cuban public administration is also going to be protected under Article 427 in cases of bribery. This is Articles 173 of the Cuban Criminal Code defining public officials and also foreign public officials. As an observer of what I found in Article 173 of the Cuban Criminal Code, if I compare it with the Spanish Criminal Code, for the Spanish Criminal Code it is very important to have two requirements to consider that individual a public official whose actions can be attributed to the public administration. On the one hand, there is a subjective requirement that individual must be or must have started to work as a public official by appointment of the relevant authority, by law, by election. And it is also important that that individual must actively and effectively be involved in the exercise of public functions. So you must go to Spanish jurisprudence, which highlights that we understand from this perspective what we understand as participation in the exercise of public functions, or whenever the activities undertaken have a social character of collective transcendence and their actions are submitted to administrative control and serve a specific function of the public administration. So public administrations or public service can also undertake private activities like, for example, the ones provided in the university law of Spain, when university professors can also do some research work under contracts that are not public service and are not subject to other controls other than that of the university. This is the concept of public official in the Spanish Criminal Code. In the Cuban Criminal Code that we referred to a while ago, a public official is anyone who holds a position that safeguards military institutions, enterprises, government offices. I think it's interesting to highlight several things here. First is that the existence of this definition of a public official has a limiting nature because a Cuban legislator or lawmaker wanted to identify who are those persons that with their actions can link their actions to that of a public administration. However, no provision has been made for a subjective link the ways under which that public official or servant gains that public office or has access to a public office. And I think that is quite a big risk, especially in an interventionist economy. When you ask what activities of the Cuban administration are not public or state-owned, this could leave room for doubt. Isn't a public official a worker of the beautiful National Hotel who takes and carries and safeguards the bags of hotel guests? They cannot be considered public official. The foreigners working in a hotel of the Meliatain in Cuba, are they public officials? I think it is very important to clearly identify the concept of a public official, because in the current moment where you're receiving foreign capital in the island, I think it is very important to clarify who are public officials, what are public activities, and what aren't. Also, the capital, as it was said earlier this morning, the intervention of companies should be welcome, provided that they are clean, honest businesses that are not involved in any sort of crime. Foreign investment should have very clear, as part of this criminal code, the set of behaviors that make up a crime, and raising the visibility of subjects actively involved in those crimes. The fourth point of my presentation, I wanted to analyze the concept of corruption, of public corruption. Why? Because many times we talk about corruption. We have in Spain, we already have the crime of private corruption, and all crimes that we link to corruption not necessarily require money to be involved, or that there is a transaction involved. In this regard, I think it is interesting to highlight that there are some behaviors like the ones that you can see on the slide. Sexual harassment in the Spanish Criminal Code. For example, in the Cuban Criminal Code, sexual harassment is not provided. We also have disobedience and denial of assistance within the concept of corruption. Apparently, there's no doubt from the criminal law viewpoint to consider as corruption the behaviors that you can see on the slide: bribery, abuse of power, embezzlement, fraud. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention something important. Neither the Spanish nor the Cuban criminal codes define the crime of public corruption. Therefore, we need additional efforts to identify the crimes we are making reference to. From that perspective, and making up for the lack of identification of both criminal codes of what is public corruption, there is no doubt, and we all in the room, or practically all in the room, agree on the fact that bribery is corruption. Abuse of power, embezzlement. Some of those who travel with me on the plane, some don't have very clear that embezzlement is corruption if the active subject is not moved with the purpose of seeking profits, but they do make profits from the public funds, then it can be considered public corruption. fraud and illegal actions, negotiations and activities banned for public officials. In Cuba, you have illegal enrichment. And now the amounts that public officials cannot justify can be seized. And we only have one last doubt, which is the crime of prevarication or malfeasance. Is that a case of corruption? In my viewpoint, there are several reasons to consider prevarication or malfeasance as another modality of corruption, regardless of the fact that public officials making an arbitrary decision knowingly does not necessarily require that that public official makes money out of this wrongdoing. But unfortunately, the cases that, at least in my country, are emerging behind a public official that grants a license for the benefit of an individual, that individual has, in most cases, given them money or a gift of some sort. So malfeasance should also be considered as corruption. We don't have to go to the criminal code to find the definition of corruption. We should go to the superior law, and there are many other regulations that provide that malfeasance is the basic modality of corruption, although that to prove the existence of a criminal pact under that malfeasance is impossible, and therefore it is difficult to punish for bribery and malfeasance. Now, referring to prevention, as the title of my presentation well said, when we talk about prevention of corruption, I wanted to highlight that I think it is easier to prevent corruption than discover the cases of corruption that have already taken place for many obvious reasons. Because these type of actions are often concealed, and because perpetrators of corruption crimes do it right in front of our noses, but we can hardly believe our eyes, and they're actually doing that. Corruption is rampant, and they feel so safe that we ignore that a decision has been made arbitrarily, or that a public official has been biased and has violated the duties inherent to their position, thus damaging and harming and undermining the public administration they're supposed to serve. So we must take a series of measures that prevent these type of behaviors, to prevent these damages for our citizens that become significantly or more vulnerable at times of crisis. In this regard, I think it is interesting to highlight measures to tackle corruption, promoting transparency, accountability. In the last reforms in Spain, this has become evident. The new law passed in 2017 of public procurement or public contracts, I think it was... It talks about the struggle against corruption and the conflict of interest, making contracting bodies or procurement bodies to ensure that the companies they are doing business with, and I dare go beyond, perhaps we should have into consideration that in order for companies to work with public administration, we should require that the companies that are hired by them should have a compliance program to ensure that corporate bodies meet their responsibilities. In this regard, when prevention fails, I've referred to the public procurement law and the accountability law. All the legal framework must put at the forefront all the instruments at hand to tackle this crime. But when the criminal code fails, the law should be enforced. In this regard, I think we must take into account that there is a need to clearly identify what are we protecting. We need to define clearly who are public officials that contain the reputation of the public administration. I think it is also very important to clearly and select sentences or penalties or sanctions. I am against imprisonment. For white-collar crimes, I don't think it is a contradiction because these active subjects or perpetrators or criminal or white-collar criminals have or must pay a fine. They must be separated or removed from the office. Perhaps they can be a sentence of poverty, or we prevent them from exercising their profession, but we must have imprisonment also for white-collar white-collar criminals by a stakeholder. White-collar criminals are those who are inserted within societies, and therefore they do not require imprisonment. If white-collar criminals are part of the society, and therefore it is not necessary to sentence them to jail, you are promoting a corrupt society, because only in corrupt societies white-collar criminals are inserted. But if you send them to jail, you can clearly meet the needs of citizens. A lady who has been involved in a white-collar crime, a lady of high society, told the judge who decided she had to pay a fine. She said that you had to increase that amount in 50 more euros because she couldn't go to her beauty parlor. I think she was making reference to the fact that not all women had 50 euros to spend in a beauty parlor. I think that we must measure the damages that they have caused to the public administration. Now I refer to the other side of the coin, because in the long run, this is the same phenomenon or crime of corruption, and we must use all our tools at hand to tackle this scourge. Thank you.